Labour are in power after 14 years of a Conservative government, and Sir Keir Starmer and his cabinet have some bold plans that, if they pull off, will be significant to the property market. Should you as a landlord be worried? Should you as a renter be excited? Well, in this video, I'm going to walk you through 1. The 7 policies Labour have declared they will action. 2. What effect they will have on landlords and tenants. And in case you're wondering why the hell you should listen to me, well, I've spent since 2013 building a UK-wide home buying company, British Home Buyers, estate agency, British Home Sellers, and my own personal property portfolio. So not only does that give me access to information you may not have, but understanding all this stuff and reading the market correctly is essential to mine and my clients' success. So let's get into it by starting with a brief history lesson. The Labour Party actually has a long history of fighting landlords. In the early 1960s, a prominent Labour MP, Tony Crosland, wrote, "Private landlord is not an appropriate form of home ownership in an advanced society." Crosland went on to write, "The landlord often looks on house property simply as an investment to give them a perpetual return with the minimum of expenditure. Worse still, they wield a degree of personal power over their tenants, which can be offensive and intolerable." So look, I can imagine if you're a tenant, you're loving this statement, and if you're a landlord, you're hating it. But Tony Crosland is not our Prime Minister, and Sir Keir Starmer has made it pretty clear that he has built a new Labour Party. But generally, Labour's history has always been very anti-landlord, and I'll let you decide if these 7 policies are going to help or hurt you as a landlord or a tenant or a homeowner or all the above. Number 1, Labour will cap corporation tax. Labour will cap corporation tax at the current level of 25%, the lowest in the G7, for the entire Parliament. And we will act if tax changes in other countries pose a risk to UK competitiveness. Now look, this is without question good news for not just landlords, but all businesses, as in theory, it will make sure corporation tax stays below other G7 countries. In case you're unaware or unsure, the reason so many landlords own property within limited companies is because of the introduction of Section 24. What Section 24 did was stop landlords that owned property in their own name deduct the mortgage as a cost. As a result, there are now 3 to 4 times more limited companies that own property than before Section 24 was introduced, despite the fact that buy-to-let property is making up a smaller and smaller share of the property market ever since the government introduced the additional 3% stamp duty on second homes or property investments. So in conclusion, corporation tax not going up is good for landlords, but will probably make little to no difference to tenants. Number 2, to get Britain building again. I get the impression most people just don't realise how negligible all governments have been since really the 70s around creating an economy that promotes new homes being built at sufficient volume. Just take a look at this graph. It shows the number of homes being built since the 20s, and you can see how since the peak in the late 60s of just over 350,000 homes being built in England, they have been dropping and dropping annually ever since, which is terrible. Something most people also don't know is between 1845 and 1911, average house prices fell 23%, but better yet, earnings rose 90% over the same period. Imagine that happening over the next 66 years. Now, the reason that happened back then was because there was a doubling of housing stock over that time. Britain was building a huge amount of new homes, of new property. It just comes to show the market is that simple. It is demand and a supply game, which is why Labour's plans to increase housing stock is so important, because if we can get an economy churning out 300,000 to 400,000 homes a year again, we're all going to start to see house prices slow down. Do you think Labour's going to succeed at building those? Now, a common argument I hear, in particular from renters, is this whole problem has been created by property investors creating too much demand, which is pushing up prices. And I get that, but there are two things on this I want you to consider. Firstly, since 2016, the number of buy-to-let properties has actually been decreasing, yet house prices have still been booming. And also, secondly, that period I mentioned just now between 1845 and 1911, where house prices dropped 23% and earnings rose 90% on average, 75% of properties back then were rented. So the real underlying issue is not landlords, although that doesn't mean there aren't bad landlords out there. The true issue is we're just not building enough property. So I really do hope the Labour government pull this off and gets the nation building again. Number 3, Labour will increase stamp duty paid by non-UK residents. Non-UK residents already pay different stamp duty rates in the UK compared to UK-based buyers. But what Labour wants to do is increase these rates. Now, these are the current rates, and although I completely agree we should always prioritise UK buyers on UK property over buyers abroad, so I think this is a great idea, in reality, in the UK, only 1% of property is actually owned by overseas buyers or companies. In London, it's only 2%. So this policy is popular, but in reality, it isn't what's going to affect house prices. Building more homes and only allowing levels of immigration the country's infrastructure can support, what is going to have the biggest effect on house prices? It's the same sort of deflection we see with immigration in the UK. There are about 40,000 people that have entered the UK illegally over the last year, which is clearly 40,000 too many. But that is compared to 1.2 million legal immigrants entering the country on an annual basis. So the illegal immigration that gets all of the headlines literally makes up no more than 3 to 4% of the total levels of legal immigration. Look, to be clear, I'm not against immigration, but governments have to ensure they set the limits appropriately to make sure our country's infrastructure can cope with that many additional people within it. Not just making sure we have enough housing, but also things like if the NHS can cope, that our schools can cope, the list goes on. Otherwise, it's no different to overfilling a stadium to increase ticket sales. It's bound to end in tears. Number 4, reforming private renting. The Conservatives' Renters Reform Bill came to nothing because it was scrapped when Rishi Sunak called the election. That, as we know, ended up being quite disastrous for him. Labour have instead introduced the Renters' Charter, which is currently set to include an end to Section 21 no-fault evictions, the right for renters to have pets, the right to make reasonable alterations to a property, to introduce a 4-month notice period for landlords, and finally, to bring an end to automatic evictions for rent arrears. So look, all these things sound sensible, but as usual, the devil's in the detail here. For instance, if you're a renter, who decides what a reasonable alteration is? If it isn't reasonable, could you end up with a bill and money taken from your deposit? And for a landlord, when Section 21 is scrapped, is the Section 8 process going to be improved? As landlords that would have issued Section 21 notices are now going to have to issue Section 8 notices instead. What effect is that going to have on the legal system, the court system? My hope is all these changes will be managed well so that it creates a net positive for renters and landlords. I know some of you will disagree with this, but you want a rental sector that importantly treats tenants with fairness and respect, but that also creates a fair environment for landlords, because ultimately, we do need a responsible level of buy-to-let property in the country. To be clear, I'm not saying the system we have right now is perfect, but we want to make it better, not worse overall. Number 5, introducing rent controls. In the past, London's Mayor Sadiq Khan, Manchester's Mayor Andy Burnham, as well as others, were calling for rent freezes in some major cities. However, in June 2023, Labour completely scrapped its pledge to bring in rent controls. So look, I guess that could change in the future, but generally rent controls in other cities abroad have seen mixed results. And so if this is ever considered in the future, it needs to be carefully thought through. I know rent controls are a hot topic amongst tenants and landlords. It would be interesting to see what you guys think. How do you think rent controls work in practice? Are there any landlords out there that think it could work well? My personal view, if I'm honest, is I don't think it's the solution. To me, the solution is to increase supply, control immigration, to just build more houses. But what do you think? Number 6, helping first-time buyers. Right now, it is projected that 1 in 3 babies born won't own their own home by the time they reach 50, which I find particularly horrifying given I have 2 children under 3. Now Labour have set a target to increase this from 1 in 3, so 33%, to 70%, which is a bold target. They plan to achieve this by introducing a freedom to buy scheme, which will essentially be a permanent mortgage guarantee scheme that will allow working people to buy with smaller deposits, with the government offering guarantees to lenders to offset the risk. This sort of thing already exists, where you might get a parent to act as a guarantor on your mortgage, which in turn reduces the risk to the lender and could mean then that you get better interest rates, for instance. But they also plan to give buyers first dibs on new build properties before overseas buyers or investors can get their hands on them, which again, given only 1% of properties are bought by overseas buyers, and most investors don't tend to buy new builds anyway, I'm not sure how valuable that is really going to be in practice, but it's good policy. So look, like how the Help to Buy schemes in the past significantly helped people buy new builds, this will help any first-time buyer buy any property, which will really help the market in general. Because even if you're not a first-time buyer, it creates transactions at the bottom of the ladder that then creates transactions up the ladder, which helps people trying to upsize, for instance. It helps the whole property market. And finally, number 7, regulating holiday homes and short-term lets. This is a big one because the rise of Airbnb and Booking.com has dramatically increased the amount of property being used for holiday let. Added to that, if you rent a property as a holiday let, it bypasses a landlord's issues with Section 24. Labour have previously mentioned they will surface a similar concept to the licensing scheme in Wales for short-term lets in England. So in short, it would require any accommodation used for short-term lets to be registered and licensed, similar to the process that exists already for HMOs in many areas. At this stage, we don't really know the detail in this, the severity of any rule changes, but again, anything that constrains the supply of holiday lets is going to really help homeowners get on the ladder, and it's going to hurt landlords. I think in general, Labour have been quite sensible around everything they've announced so far. I just hope they keep their promise on building those 1.5 million new homes. What do you think about all this? I'll see you in the next video up here.